We're talking about parables. It says of Jesus' teaching generally, he did not speak to them except in a parable. It was his characteristic way of speaking. I want to underscore again the context in which he spoke these parables. A kingdom that had been inaugurated but was not yet consummated. Now keep that image in mind. D-Day and VE Day. Bethlehem is the invasion into history. His second coming, physically, bodily, suddenly, universally, is Victory Day. You best understand the parables as how to live between inauguration and consummation. And that particularly applies to this collection of parables in Matthew 25, to which I'd call your attention, Matthew 25. Now, context is important in parabolic interpretation, as it is in everything. The parables in Matthew 25 were spoken on Tuesday of Holy Week. The Tuesday in between his triumphant entry on Sunday and his resurrection the following Sunday. They are his last public teaching. Keep that context in mind. What did Jesus talk about in his last public teaching? Now there's another context. And that is, when was Matthew's gospel written? Eusebius, the father of church history, said in AD 325 that Matthew wrote a gospel in Hebrew for the Hebrews. Now, we don't have the Hebrew gospel, but that's what the father of church history said. Matthew, who was a Jew, wrote a gospel in Hebrew for the Hebrews. That's the earliest word we have about the formation of Matthew. Matthew was likely written about 70 or 80, somewhere in there AD. Some would plan it earlier, but say 70 AD. The church was having to come to grips with a reality. And the New Testament scholars call it the delayed parousia. That early church was absolutely agog. Eyes wide open, heart beating, breath abated, palms perspiring. Will he come back today? They believed it. But then they had to come to grips with the fact, not that he wasn't coming back, but it hadn't been yet. AD 40, AD 50, AD 60, AD 70, we're still waiting. And Matthew wrote his gospel in that circumstance. And you see it all over the parables in Matthew chapter 25. Parables that were spoken by Jesus on Tuesday. Jesus knew that there'd be some delay. He didn't know when. Remember what he said? Even the Son of Man doesn't know. Well, let's look at these parables that all say, watch. It could be any time. The first we've been talking about is the parable of the 10 virgins. It's a village wedding feast. They're waiting for the bridegroom to emerge. Weddings in that day, you went and got the bride, took her from her house to your house. You paraded down the main street, a lamplight parade. Half of them run out of oil. Look at verse 13. Be on the alert then. You do not know the day nor the hour. For those who now said it is AD 70, they didn't call it that, but it's these years, and he hasn't come yet. The word of this parable, the big idea is watch. Be alert. It could be any minute, it could be now. Spoken by Jesus on Tuesday of Holy Week, but written by Matthew around AD 70 to a church coming to grips with the fact that he hasn't come yet, but he is coming. But I want to dwell a good deal on the second one of these because it has been misinterpreted because of the word talent. We tend to call it, Matthew 25:14 through 30, the parable of the what? Talents. The difficulty with that is that we have reduced it to what we do with our own what? Talents. I teach, I can sing, I can serve, I can bake. No. The talent, even a superficial study of exegetical work will tell you that the talent was the largest denomination of currency minted in the Greek world. It's the word talenta. Talenta. Even one of them was a huge amount of money. All of the gold in Herod's temple, the capital of Judaism, was 800 talents. To have one of those 800 was to have a fortune. To have two of them was to have, or to have five of them was to have an enormous legacy. The parable of the talents is about one thing, and that is the willingness to risk for the sake of the kingdom of God. Now, it's a good example of interpreting parables. First of all, when you decide it is about risk, you need to use some images in talking to the congregation to get them to think about riskness. If you're a teacher or a preacher, it's good to start with nowness rather than thenness, here-ness rather than there-ness, and talk about how people take risk today. It embeds in the mind of the listeners the idea of riskness. I have a wealthy friend that's a day trader. He wakes up every morning. The man's already a multi-millionaire, and he's nearly 90 years old, but he'll turn on CNBC, the business channel, get his stockbroker, and spend the day putting risks in the market in a complicated strategy called covered calls. Some days he makes millions, some days he loses millions. He does it because he enjoys the risk. One of my colleagues, Liling Nan, an Old Testament professor, a Lao lady, she's a rock climber. She wedges her fingers and toes into the cracks of sheer rock faces and spiders her way up because she enjoys the risk. Think about things that are images of risk. The way to start talking about this parable is to get people to think nowness in the orbit of risk. You can come up with some. And yet, in most cities, the last people associated with risk is the church of a risen Christ. Somebody said you could put the 7 last words of the church up behind it and put it on the screen. We never did it that way before. Incarcerated in our own inertia, stultified in our own stagnation, we're riskless people. And yet, Jesus said, while you're living between already and not yet, between thenness and nowness, you need to be a people willing to take the stuff of life and risk it. Now let's talk a little bit about parabolic interpretation. The 5-talent servant and the 2-talent servant in this are really stage properties. They're supporting actors. The real star of this, the anti-hero, is the man who's given 1 talent. The others are there to set him off in stark relief. Even though he has less to lose than the other, he'd rather be riskless than risk the stuff of life. Now, did you hear the phrase I just used? Note that phrase, the stuff of life. I've decided that talent so throws you off the meaning of this that I like to use the word the stuff that God gives you. All of us have got stuff. Here's what I mean. Our physical strength, our mental acuity, our credentials, our degrees, our connections, our networks, our investments, all of us have got stuff. And this parable says, what are you going to do with the stuff that I've given you? Are you going to risk it for my sake? Or are you going to do what this servant did and bury it? This is really a parable in a sense in 3 acts. They're given the stuff of life. 2 of them risk it. 1 of them buries it. That's the 2nd act. But in the 3rd act, Jesus addresses what I talked about at the beginning, and that is the delayed parousia, his delayed second coming. And I want you to, if you mark in your Bibles, look at verse 19 and mark this. Now, after a long time, the master of those servants came. Would you mark that? After a long time. Now, let me say this about liberal Christianity. And by liberal Christianity, or sometimes called progressive Christianity, I'm just going to tell it like it is. It's given up on the second coming. C.H. Dodd of Cambridge, a famous 20th century British New Testament scholar, C.H. Dodd, spoke of what's called realized eschatology. He said, all you're going to get is in Jesus' first coming. It's called realized eschatology. He said, that's it. He came, he left the Spirit, that's it. And that has become the worldwide view of liberal or progressive Christianity. There is no futurity in terms of a second coming of Jesus Christ. We're here, we ought to make this a better place, but forget about it in terms of a literal, physical, bodily, visible, instant return of Jesus. Now come close to me. You do not have biblical Christianity without the anticipation that he's coming back. Visibly, bodily, suddenly, universally. And that's the setting of these parables. After a long time, the Lord of those servants comes. Now what does he find? He finds that 2 of them have taken a risk. They've put the money out in the market. 5 got 5 more, 2 got 2 more, but they're stage property to put center stage this servant who's prudent but useless. I buried it. In fact, in Luke's version, it's very interesting. Luke's called the parable of the pounds. In Luke, he's a gentleman riskless. He wraps it in a napkin and buries it. If you're going to bury it, you do it in style. Look good about it. He's nailed to his risklessness. None of us understands everything about the judgment, but one of the things about the judgment is going to be this. We're going to be weighed, not for salvation, but weighed at the point of whether we took a risk. Did we always play it safe? You see, that the rabbis also told parables, and they told a parable about a man who divided his substance among his servants. One of them went out and buried it, and the others invested it. And in the rabbi's parable, they made the man who buried it the hero of the parable, and they made those who risked it the anti-heroes, the villains. No wonder they said, we've never heard stories like Jesus told. Jesus said to be prudent but riskless. Well, he used the toughest language of any of the parables. If you look at this parable, he looks at that. Look, he says, you wicked, lazy servant. Now you think about that. Jesus was at that well with the Samaritan woman, who had several marriage certificates. And he didn't say, "You wicked, lazy woman." No, you can think with me. Down in John 8, when he was in the street with that woman caught in the very act of adultery, dragged out of a tent, he didn't say, "You wicked, lazy woman." But when this person refused to risk the stuff of life, it's the toughest language in the parables. Paneros, wicked, that's the same word in the Lord's Prayer. Deliver us from the wicked one. Lazy means sloth. That means incarcerated in his own inertia, stultified in his own stagnation, in the paralysis of analysis, never willing to do anything. And then he says, "You're a zero. Take it from him and give it to the one who has 10. And I think one thing important in preaching the parables is to use an image to reinforce the image. Reinhold Niebuhr of Yale told the story about an inland farmland boy somewhere on the plains states in the U.S. If you ever see it out in Kansas and Nebraska and Iowa, the land is as flat as this floor for 1,000 miles. This boy had never seen the sea. He imagined sailing on a tall-masted sailing ship. So he made his way to a port city, lied about his age, got on a tall-masted sail ship. Third day out, the captain commanded him to assume the watch in the crow's nest. He went halfway up and froze, clutching the mast. He'd never been that high in his life. And he wouldn't go up and he wouldn't go down. He didn't want to go down because the old seasoned salt sailors were ridiculing him. He didn't want to go up because he was afraid of the height. So he froze halfway up, neither up nor down, clinging. That's the image here. Here is someone who has the stuff of life, and Jesus said, "For my sake, risk it." Do something. Halitosis is better than no breath at all. Think about that. Really. Now I want you to look at this. 5-talent servant got 5. He didn't say to the 2-talent servant, "You discounted 2-talent servant, why didn't you get 5?" He knew what that person could risk. Had that 1-talent servant risked it and lost it, I have biblical warrant to believe that the Lord of all of our stuff would have said what that Lord said to David when he told David he couldn't build the temple. Remember it? He said, "You've been a man of war. You can't build it, but I know you had it in your heart." If he's just given you pebbles, he doesn't expect you to build pyramids, but he expects you to build something. If he's given you burlap thread, he doesn't expect you to weave a golden garment, but he expects you to weave something. That 1-talent servant had thrown it out and lost it in risk. I think the Lord of the risk would have said, "I knew your heart." And so you have this parable that calls on us to risk. Now the next parable in this collection of Tuesday parables is a different sounding parable. It's a parable still here about a king. Here you had a bridegroom in the parable of the wise and foolish virgins. Jesus is in the place of the bridegroom. In the parable of the talents, he's in the place of the master who divides them up. In the next parable, sheep and goats, he's in the place of the king. Remember, already and not yet, watch. I haven't come yet, but I'm coming. But when I come, you know this parable from Bible study. Sheep and goats, separated by 6 things. according to the word, is ethne, the nations, separated by 6 things, these simple acts that demonstrate blessedness. You know them. You probably memorize them. Hungry, thirsty, stranger, naked, sick, prison. Now, that's not a list that you check off. It's not, I saw this guy on the street and I flipped him a coin. No. It's talking about a way of life that he calls blessed. Here's how blessed people live. If you really want to get into that, look at the Beatitudes. If you're a beatitude person, he says what? Come you blessed of my Father. He's talking about how blessed people live. You don't get it on the cheap. He says a way of life. Now here is where I want you to notice the slyness of some parables. Watch this. We think those goats didn't know. They said, when did we see you? But did you ever notice this? The sheep didn't know either. Now let that sink in. Read it. The sheep said, when did we see you hungry? When did we see you? The sheep didn't know. A friend of mine wrote a funny little book. It was every chapter had a tombstone on it, and on that tombstone was something that buried an aspiring minister. One of the tombstones had on it, he hugged himself to death. It's a bad way to go, self-hugulation. The sheep didn't know. I think it's one of the most insightful things in these parables of Holy Week. And in some ways, it's a hopeful thing. That day, when it comes, and as surely it will, and when each of us has an individual appointment with the King, I think about this. I'm closer to it than I've ever been, he's standing there. I don't know. It says there's books. I don't know what all that means. He's looking in the G's. Gregory. Oh, there you are, Gregory. Yeah. He picks out something. SC, Gregory, 1988. June 1988. Oh, yeah. Yes, Lord, yeah. Oh, yes. That's when I preached the convention at Southern Baptist Convention in San Antonio, Texas. 35,000 people there. Probably the most quoted sermon I ever preached. King's going to say, I don't know. I don't go to those meetings very often. What? No, but do you remember in the hallway before you preached that, one of your students from 15 years before stopped you and told you the problems in his ministry? You took time to listen to him, even though you had so much on your mind. King's going to say, I remember that. Now, let's see here. What we think the king is impressed with doesn't have a thing to do with what impresses the king. And if you're a blessed person, you're going to be just like the sheep. When did we see you? It's encouraging because he's going to show you things you never, ever saw. That's good news. Because the king is watching and there's going to be a lot of surprises. Let me just say one other thing. And quickly, another parable of the risk. If you just flip over to Matthew 13, and I want to show you this because this is a germ parable. Very, very short. A one-verse parable, and then a two-verse parable. they're parables of risk, the risk of seeking and the risk of finding. Kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in the field, which a man found and hid, and from joy over it he goes and sells all he has and buys that field. Boom, that's it, one sentence. Draws a picture of a world. It's out in the country. Here's a day laborer plowing the field of another man to get his denarius, just to get a piece of pita bread, something to get him through the night. He had to be paid at the end of the day. Leviticus said, James says, you got to pay a day laborer that day. All he wants to do is finish. The sun is shining on his head. The sand is searing his sandals. He just wants to finish when late in the afternoon there's a clink. And he falls on his knees, and the plowshare has hit an amphora, a clay jar. He rips the top off of it, and there's the gleam of gold. Now, once again, if you're going to preach this sort of thing, you don't have some biblical backgrounds. You're not likely going to find a pot of gold out in your garden. But in that world, without banks, savings and loans, safe rooms, walled safes, there was nowhere. When the Babylonians, the Egyptians came to hide your stuff, you'd run out and bury it. As late as the 19th century, in Caesarea by the sea, some people digging up a garden found 3 pots full of gold coins with Alexander the Great's face on it from 323 BC. Huge find. Treasures were there. This man was a surprised finder. Look what he did. He looked around. I'm sure he looked around. Covered it up, went and liquidated whatever a poor day laborer would have and bought the field so he could have the treasure. This is a parable of crisis. To take a risk at the opportune time. Now look at the little twin parable, very much different from this. In Matthew 13:45, this isn't a day laborer, it's a pearl merchant. It's not a retailer, it's a pearl wholesaler. The kingdom of heaven is like a merchant seeking fine pearls, and who finding one pearl of great value, he went and sold all that he had and bought it. Couldn't be any more different. It's not a day laborer, it's a wealthy wholesale jeweler. He's over in the Persian Gulf seeking fine pearls. You can almost see the picture. Just like there are oil sheiks today, there were pearl sheiks back then. The man's invited into the tented city. There's ottomans around. He comes into an inner chamber. He sits down on the floor. There's the pearl sheik. They have some strong coffee, and then out of a silken purse, he palms a pearl of perfect proportion. The pearl merchant has never seen anything like it. And he liquidates his pearl empire to have that one pearl. Plowman was a surprised finder. The pearl merchant's a serious seeker. We're surrounded with people who are serious seekers. They really are. Up and down these streets and avenues and boulevards and closes here, people who are asking, what is life about? Is it the same old, same old? Is there any meaning? I think, and I'm haunted by the fact in recent weeks, a world-famous traveling gastronomist and a fashion idol both took their life, his and hers, having everything people think they want gone. We need to take that seriously. This man found a pearl of great price and liquidated his pearl empire. We need to preach this and press it in a way that there come moments in life which we must risk and act, or the moment goes by. Anybody remember Major Thomas, Ian Thomas? He's still spoken of here, a Keswick speaker. Interesting man. Major Thomas told the story about a little beggar beside the road. I think he was in India. fingering rice in a bowl. He had a few grains between himself and starvation. He saw smoke on the horizon. He put his little ear to the ground and heard 100 horses' hooves and knew it was the gilded coach of the Maharaja. The grandee coming down that road, fingering his rice in his little loincloth. And to his astonishment, the coach stopped. The Maharaja got out. He held up his little cup. And the Maharaja said, "Give me a grain of your rice." Spat on the ground, couldn't believe it. Gave the man a grain of rice. Cursed his karma. He wants my rice. The grand one said, "Is that all?" "Yes." And the coach down the road. He was fingering his little bowl and found something hard, harder than rice. Picked it out, and it was a grain of gold. In the exchange, it would have been a grain of gold for every grain of rice. That's a parable about this parable. Jesus said, if anyone would save life, you'll lose it, but if you lose it for my sake in the kingdom, you'll find it. In a sense, these parables of the risk are about exchanging grains of rice for grains of gold. Just to summarize before a few more questions and answers, remember these parables are between already and not yet. The best way to interpret all of the parables is putting them between Jesus' inauguration of the reign of God in Bethlehem and his consummation of the reign of God when he comes visibly, suddenly, universally, in his parousia, his coming again. That's where you put these parables, living between D-Day and Victory Day.